looking at today is liquid highways. Well, that would be the river traffic. River traffic was your easiest starting point to get a lot of something somewhere else. We're in a point of history talking today about back in the 1850s. We're talking about Oregon, the Northwest, the Oregon Trail, and the great quest to move west for opportunity to own your own land. One thing I like to do is try to set the setting and what it was like to be alive during that time, and why would people risk their lives to go 2,500 miles out to the west coast to a land that has no towns, except for Astoria was the earliest settlement right on the Columbia, Oregon City being the second, and then after that it was Lafayette, Oregon, surprisingly. The Oregon Trail started in 1843, and Yamhill County is as old as 1843. However, it was a huge county. It was diced up into a bunch of smaller counties following as the years progressed, and towns and more locally governed people could manage their closer areas, and they'd create smaller counties. But really, one of the biggest problems after coming out west, over a 2,500-mile wagon ride from the Midwest, 1 out of 10 people died. And could you imagine signing up to go on a cruise today and saying, hey, I want to go on this cruise, and yet, well, 1 out of 10 of you probably going to fall overboard or something. You know, you'd have to ask yourself, would you take that cruise? Well, for this, it wasn't recreation, it was opportunity. And people were hungry for the opportunity to have their own farmland. And on the East Coast, all of the land had been occupied. And if you think about every family having 7 or 12 kids, where are they going to have their 500-acre farm? You know, we're not making more dirt. And so the conquest to move west, manifest destiny. Thomas Jefferson, there's several different presidents that had that idea, and that's how the idea of Lewis and Clark was spawned in the 1804 or 5 and 6. They came out to Astoria, and it took 2 years. They kind of roughly mapped the land. They were looking for that Northwest Passage that just really didn't exist. They're looking for maybe a river that could carry them all the way through. After all, the Columbia was a known quantity, but how far did it go and where did it go? It wasn't a clean, easy path either. So the Oregon Trail was spawned in 1843 with this idea that if you go west, if you're single, you could claim 320 acres. And if you're married, you were 640. And so consequently, a lot of people got married on the Oregon Trail. They would boost their land grab opportunities. And so the first thing they would encounter when they get out to Columbia after a laborious 3-month, 4-month trek, it would actually be late September, November, October. It would be late in the year. There'd be no time to build shelter. There'd be no time to plant a crop and have your own food source. People were at the mercy of Fort Vancouver. John McLaughlin, the Hudson Bay Company, a French-owned company, they were here to harvest the fruits of the land, and happened to be beaver pelts and whatever else, whatever commodity that this region had was going to support this corporation. And John McLaughlin became sympathetic to the pioneers coming out west. In fact, so much so that the company eventually got rid of him because he was more for settling in the love of the land than the profits of that company. This is a great picture here of this log cabin. How primitive is this? It's got a sod roof, and it's just plain old logs. It's looks to me about a 12 by maybe 8 or 10. This would have been the first home you could possibly scratch together in short order and winter over and be out of the elements of snow and rain and, of course, all the mud that came along with all the rain. Pretty much everybody was at the mercy of whoever was already here. And there was a small population of fur traders and hunters and trappers in the valley, and they had compassion for the incoming travelers. So if we were to say 1843, that was the beginning of the Oregon Trail. Every year, people came over the Oregon Trail. There was about 1,500 people to 2,000 people making that trek. Not a lot, you know. And it wasn't until the gold rush of 1849 in California that popped those numbers all the way up to 50 and 60,000 a year. And so for the first 8 years, we had people just making their land claims, trying to clear land, trying to just get around. Because after all, about 8 months out of the year, you could not pull a wagon on a road because they were just too muddy. You'd get stuck. And your only opportunity to pull a wagon in the winter was if it was very cold and the ground was froze hard, and then you could perhaps possibly pull a wagon full of gunny sacks full of wheat to a grist mill, if there was a grist mill yet. Grist is a fancy word for grind. That's a flour mill where they take the raw wheat from the farmer and grind it up. McMinnville had one. It was built in 1853 by William Newby, which is one of the founders of McMinnville. And he owned the land in the very dead center of McMinnville, which incorporates all of 3rd Street. And he even he basically offered free lots for any merchant that wanted to build a property or build their business. And that idea was spawned after this grist mill became the hub of every farmer coming to what wasn't a town, but was just the corner by the library, by the swimming pool. And the grist mill was just behind there. And today, if you go down in McMinnville City Park, you'll see the original millstones with a plaque and all the descriptions, dates, and all that stuff. So immediately he thought, well, this could be a town. So he created what we know as McMinnville, and that's kind of the story of most any establishment. There was a lot of dreamers, empire builders, you might say. That was kind of the era of people really selling their city that wasn't a city yet. And so there's many reasons we could talk on another series about how McMinnville, why it was successful. Right now we're looking at a photo of a steamship on the Yamhill near Dayton, Oregon. Yeah, this is a great example of a very muddy street. This one, I believe, is Amity. You see the wagon ruts and the all wood buildings, no brick. Brick didn't come around until about the 1880s. Willamina was responsible for an enormous amount of brick production that ran all the way till 1974 or 84, one of those dates. I think it was 74. And that brick plant now is Hampton Lumber out there in Willamina. Yet another picture of McMinnville. In 1912, McMinnville paved its streets. And so we're looking east in this photo with all the wagons, and you see the new furniture sign and the grocery sign on the right. The next block up in the faded distance is the 1893 building, very identifiable by a very distinct gable peak in the center. So we're looking east, and that's the south side of the block. But the photo is important because there's no pavement. And west of Dayton, we're looking at an old Model T. Between Dayton and Amity, and it's looking west, so Dayton would be to your back. This is 2nd and B Street, 1900. I believe the trajectory of looking at this would be the First Federal Bank. Now they have a brand new 3-story building there. This is about the 4th version of something on this corner. And finally, we get to a picture of some boat traffic. This picture here could have easily been mistaken for a scene in Dayton. However, if you look at the rocky shoreline on the far side of the shore, it's all rocks. This is over in Oregon City area. Dayton did have a similar bridge to like this that was knocked out by a floating bridge from Lafayette that in a storm floated down and knocked out the other bridge. Here we're looking at Dayton, and you've got about a 80 to 100 foot steam vessel, and these were the primary way to get everyone's farming produce and harvest to someplace beyond Yamhill County. Because if all we did was barter with each other in this own little community, we wouldn't have any new money. And so even in the 1860s and 70s, as much product as we could was going to go to San Francisco. And so it would have to go through the locks at Oregon City, which was constructed in 1873, and then out to Astoria on a side wheel, stern wheeler vessel, and it would go all the way to San Francisco. Then we would have new money introduced to our economy. Banking was difficult. There was only a bank in Oregon City. 1883, McMinnville got its own bank, and that radically changed McMinnville. And it was one of the leading reasons why McMinnville got the county seat just 5 years after that. We're looking at a photo here right on the waters of Dayton. This is the Yamhill River. And I like this picture because if you look and squint real hard, you can see workers carrying gunny sacks of, I would most likely say probably wheat, down that ramp and down into the belly of this. This is a pretty good size steamship, probably 100 feet long. And if you go upstream from Dayton, just a mile, not even, there's a wide spot in the river. It's on a corner, and that's where they would turn these boats around and then head back down to the Willamette. After all of this wheat needed to go away from Yamhill County, not further into Yamhill County. And so it would go down 6 miles on the Yamhill, which is a very snaky, curving turn, you know. It looks like a garden hose and a kink in your backyard. And so with all these curving rivers, it added a lot of mileage to getting, basically, if you were to fly like a bird from Dayton to the Willamette, it wouldn't be much more than a mile or two. But it's 6 miles. Then once you're on the Willamette, it's multiple miles up past Newburgh and then on to Oregon City. You couldn't go any further than Oregon City due to the Oregon City Falls, which still exists today. There was a lot of industry around there. That was where the beginning of West Lynn started, but it was called Lynn City. West Lynn is west of Lynn City. Lynn City never made it. Oregon City made it, of course, and then just upstream from Oregon City was Kanawha. And Kanawha means canoe place. It's an Indian, most likely an Indian term. It has a nice little sandy, rocky shoreline. Not rocky in a bad way. It was easy to park a boat on it and then basically carry all those goods overland, around the falls, and then back onto some kind of a floating vessel that would take it to places beyond. Until 1873, everybody had to take all their cargo and then bring it around the falls and then reload it on the downside of the falls. The railroad used to run into Dayton, and that's a whole other subject matter, but the owner of the railroad didn't want to build railroad again there because, like, hey, this is a chronic flood zone. If you want us to rebuild, and this was actually William Reed, a Scot who bought the Farmers Railroad. He said, hey, you know what? If we're going to relocate in Dayton, this is high risk. I'm not going to put all my capital into here and have it get washed away again. So if you want to put in $8,000, Dayton, we'll rebuild. Because it washed out his engine house, and he had a turntable that turned the locomotives back around to head to Sheridan and parts around. They said, no, you need us. You know, Dayton was a little arrogant. And William Reed, the Scottish guy that came in, and he's a very good guy. There were some railroad people that were crooked as a dog's hind leg. Subject matter for another conversation. But he just decided, you know what, I can find a better. I'm going to scout around. I already know there's a better place to put an access point to the river with my railroad, and that place happened to be Dundee. And so when you're coming into Dundee, headed north, there's a little county road called Full Court's Landing, and I know I've been sitting in traffic and backed up and kind of irritated, and you see some jerk, you think, driving down the fog line, you know, that's going to pass you up and cut everybody off. But at the last moment, he turns right, and he goes down Full Court's Landing Road. And he's not cutting anybody off. He probably just wants to go home. And so Full Court's Landing was named after a family, Full Court's. But there was great efforts to build a really big bridge for railroad to go across. And that would be crossing the Willamette at that point, not the Yamhill. And so the bridge got half built. The railroad got bought out secretively by their competitor, and then the bridge never happened. But he had railroad laid on the other side of that, all the way to Brownsville or Coburg, Eugene area. And he was on this quest to get to California with his narrow gauge railroad. Meanwhile, the standard gauge railroad, which is 4 foot 8 and 10 inches or something like that, was, you know, taking numbers and kicking butts and whatever, and getting south as well. Our railroad connection with the California hookup was 1883. And so that connected us to that 1869 Provo, Utah Transcontinental Railroad that was a big deal. The Golden Spike, some people remember that from high school history. So that connected the coast to coast, but the Northwest was still cut off on railroad traffic till 1883. In the meanwhile, we were really into ship traffic, and as we're looking at this photo here, this is the Dayton Bridge that crossed the Yamhill, and there's a little warehouse on the right, not that little. There was 4 or 5 different warehouses on the riverfront of Dayton. And the reason why I would say they're also warehouses is because we couldn't always ship river traffic year-round. If the water was too low, boats getting stuck on sandbars. There was a lot of dredging that had to happen. There was a lot of timber clearing on the, not always timber, sometimes there's cottonwoods and whatever trees wanted to grow on the riverbank. They would fall into the river. A boat would come across it, snag up on it, and it would sink one side. The good news is the Yamhill's not very deep, so if you sunk, you weren't going to die. you're just going to be stuck there, and you're going to be about 5 or 6 feet lower than you should be. The draft on most of those boats were only 3 to 4 feet, so they could coast over a lot of shallow water, which is pretty darn helpful. Another picture, just probably maybe 30 yards further back up this street. This is actually Ferry Street. This is the main street that runs past the park and goes straight down to the river. Today, if you go down there, there's a little footbridge that was built in the mid-90s. And that crosses over, and it would basically go to the Portland-Dayton RV Park. I think that park has some new name. I don't remember it. Another great example, this is Dayton. Very flooded. And the reason why we don't have these kind of extreme floods today is if you go further up the Willamette upstream, there's multiple reservoirs that help to contain the rush of floodwater when we have a heavy storm. And that's why they drain the reservoirs in late fall in preparation to hold back heavy storms from avoiding the picture that we're looking at here, which is Dayton, mostly underwater. This is also on Ferry Street. The hill in the background would be over where Stoller Vineyard is, the Red Hills looking north. And it was a great big deal. Here we're looking at a huge celebration, and you're thinking, what's the big deal here? There's a steamship, but we have people with horns and instruments. And some of these ships they'd adorn with all kinds of fancy garland and flowers. Well, it was a very big deal for the economy if a steamship was to add a service to your town. Because then after all of a sudden now, you were a shipping port. Huge deal. Now there's going to be people that wouldn't normally come to your town that are coming to your town. And everyone in the area is bringing all their produce, grain, whatever it is that they grow, and they want to sell to the world beyond, would be coming on these boats. And it was a pretty common thing for people in Oregon City to, if you were affluent and you had some money and you wanted to go listen to an orator speak, we had people that would roam the country and present whatever it is they were going to talk about. Sometimes it would be poetry. Sometimes it would be politics, or maybe it would be theology, or maybe it would be, psychology. Whatever the thing is, people would get on a boat in Oregon City, and by noon they could be in Lafayette. And once they were in Lafayette, they would stroll up to the park and listen to an orator for 4 or 5 hours, a long time. And they still had time to get on their boat in Lafayette and go back to Oregon City and maybe have dinner on the steamboat. And that's what you would do if you were doing an outing. This is a photo that I took. This is down on the Yamhill. If I was to walk behind this little wood structure, it's not little, that you're looking at. It's probably 50 feet tall, and there's actually 2 of them. It's under a lot of underbrush, and you can't see it. But this apparently was a log dump. One way to get a lot of logs down to a mill was to dump them in the river and float them as far as you could. There was another strategy called splash damming, and that's where they would literally have gates in a dam, and they would hold back 10 feet of water and, hundreds and hundreds of logs behind it, and they would open it up like a toilet flush, and it would just go downstream, knocking out cattle farmers' fences. And so that became illegal. Over a course of time, there was a judgment against no more splash damming because of all the property damage of just, can you imagine a toilet flush of logs just rolling through your cow pasture? But this one was different. Rail traffic, as far as I understand, there was a rail line very close, because this is just upstream from Full Court's Landing that we were talking about earlier. This would be behind Gun Club Road. If you're going north on 99, you're going to pass the Dayton truck scales on the north side, and then Firestone Farms on the right, that little fruit stand that used to sell a bunch of stuff. Well, if you just start walking behind there and go to the river, you're going to bump into this picture here. This is a way for them to let the logs down to the river to float them down to a mill, most likely maybe Newburgh, maybe Oregon City. Yamhill has about 2.5 miles left before it dumps into the Willamette at this certain picture here behind Firestone Farms, which is out of business. Here's a picture to explain what I was talking about. There's a little yellow arrow, and that's where the photo was taken. Directly north of that is Highway 99W. You can see at a diagonal trajectory going northeast. This is the construction of the Lafayette locks. They were a pipe dream of I would go back as far as, say, 1855. The first boat to float around and put some of the natives out of business. This is one thing I didn't talk about, but some of the natives had it was like a flat boat. They would load up a whole bunch of grain. They would float this down on this. It's not a canoe. It's wider. Imagine what a paint pan would look like in the water. Very flat, shallow sides, longer than it is wide by probably 3 times. They would load that up. They would float that from Dayton down to Oregon City. Oregon City had a grist mill. Dayton, McMinnville, nobody had a grist mill yet. And so they had to take their grain down there to get it processed. Well, the Indians, natives, they were put out of business by early 1850s. 1851, the Hoosier was the first steamboat to float around the Yamhill, definitely in the Willamette. And in 1851, 3 or 4 more boats came into service right away. And the town that I was referencing called Kanawha still shows up on your Google map when you look at it. I don't know if it's necessarily a town that's incorporated anymore. It's a dot on a map, but they built quite a few of these steamboats right there on Kanawha. And then that was above those locks that weren't there. Those locks weren't there till 1873. So basically, they were building boats for the upper river, the upper Willamette. Now back to this photo. We're looking at the construction of the Lafayette locks. Lafayette locks were 125-foot long chamber, and it raised the water 15 or 16 feet. So behind this dam and behind this locks upstream, put it into flood stage. Now you could float a boat safely without hitting a snag and hitting a sandbar all the way to McMinnville. The problem is the Lafayette locks weren't done and finished until 1900. Well, that's about 25, 30, even 40 years too late. By this point, it was just a losing affair. There was a few different private operators that tried to run it, but it was just so obsolete. The rail traffic was much more efficient, and they could get rail to 100 different more locations than wherever the river allowed you to. The locks here ran for a decade or two, and it was just so unprofitable that finally the government took it over, and they ran it till 1954, and then they closed it down. In fact, there's a story that even personally touches my family, because my mom and dad, they're locals here. Mom was a state champion swimmer, and Dad was a state champion wrestler as well. As far as I understand, he was drowning in the reservoir behind the dam, and my mom swam a plank out to him and saved his life. That would have been about 1956 or 7. I love my parents, and they were just wonderful people, and they're no longer with me. This is Steamboat Bonita on the Yamhill River locks, and that's about all I can tell you. But they were pretty little vessels, and of course, just like anything, like people are proud of their Harley motorcycles, people were very proud of their river boats. The main thing to understand is transportation or getting places was obviously nothing like it is today. We have traffic in Dundee. We have traffic in Portland, and I probably hate it as much as anybody going through Portland. Human race is always industrious, and we're always looking for a better way to do whatever we're doing, and that's what we call progress, I guess.